Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Hello. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all, also on behalf of my colleagues at the ETUI and brothers and sisters from the ETUC, and especially on behalf of Director General Philippe Pochet, who is currently attending another meeting, but will be joining us soon. It's a pleasure to welcome you both physically and virtually, if you're joining us online, to this joint ETUI-ETUC conference with the title, A Blueprint for Equality. All those of you who follow our work will already know that every 2 years, more or less, ETUC and ETUI jointly identify a topic worth exploring collectively and in greater depth through the input of academic experts, researchers, union officials, policymakers, and activists. We tend to refer to these conferences as the big conference, and for good reasons. Over the next 3 days, there will be more than 1,000 participants that will be joining our proceedings, both here at the TON Conference Center in Brussels and online. And in a way, as it happens these days with hybrid conferences, we're going to have 2 conferences in one, and especially those of you attending online will no doubt greatly enjoy and benefit from the efforts of a dedicated team of colleagues and, of course, your online facilitator, Jackie. During the first part of this conference, today and tomorrow morning, some 90+ researchers, academics, trade union experts, officials, activists, many of them colleagues from the ETUI, will be sharing with us a number of new, fresh ideas, perspectives, and new analysis that will be discussed across 15 panels running in 3 parallel sessions. Then tomorrow in the afternoon, the second part, the more normative and political part of the conference, will be opened by Luca Vicentini, the General Secretary of the ETUC, Philippe Pochet, the General Director of the ETUI. And it will be followed by 5 more plenary sessions, hosting a long list of trade union, policy, and intellectual heavyweights, from Commissioner Nicholas Schmidt, members of the ETUC Secretariat, virtually the entire Secretariat, including its 2 Deputy General Secretaries, Esther Lynch and Klaus-Michael Stahl, Sharon Barrow, ITUC General Secretary, Heinz Köhler, the Assistant Director General at the ILO, and academics of the caliber of Thomas Piketty, Kate Raworth, Sandy Fredman, Isabel Ferreras, and just to name a few, there's many more big names that will be participating and contributing. This is, believe me, though, it will soon become apparent to you all, a titanic intellectual, organizational, and logistical effort. And I would like to ask you to join me in thanking all of our colleagues at the ETUI and at ETUC for their contribution and for the work and for the brilliant ideas that you'll be hearing about in the coming hours and days. I would also like to thank our media partners, Alternative Économique, Alternativas Económicas, EU Observer, the Green European Journal, Social Europe, and Vox Europe, for their support in disseminating our work. Thank you. Thank you all. This year's conference, it's dedicated to exploring ideas, institutions, actors, and processes that could lead us on a path for an equal or a more equal society. Hence, the deliberately normative title, A Blueprint for Equality. A great paradox of our time is that while there is a general consensus that growing inequalities are threatening social, economic, and even human development, there appears to be little collective reflection on what action should be taken in order to redress this state of affairs. On the one hand, we all seem to agree, and have agreed for the best part of the last probably couple of decades, that inequalities are bad. On the other, we struggle to take the next logical step and address them. This paradox was noted a few years ago by academic sociologist Joe Litter, who rightly pointed out that while we had reached a near saturation point in our critical analysis of inequalities, we had yet to, quote, open our political imaginations to determine what a more equal world really is. A big conference seeks to trigger precisely such a process of reflection and debate. The discourse surrounding inequality must move beyond the, no doubt important, even essential, task of mapping out, measuring, and ascertaining the many facets and precise nature of this multidimensional and complex problem, and embark onto the more normative quest of imagining and defining a more equal society. In the next few minutes, I will try to sketch out 3 key concepts that I think over the next couple of days will be no doubt tested, hopefully fleshed out more comprehensively. Firstly, I will suggest that inequality being a multidimensional problem, addressing it requires action on a number of different levels and a focus on a range of different dimensions, all intimately interconnected. Secondly, that once we have identified the various dimensions of action required, so to speak, the building blocks of the new edifice of a more equal society, we need to agree on the key principles and political and philosophical orientations that should guide such actions. This is not an anodyne exercise, as ultimately it will involve political choices and, of course, the necessary involvement of democratic processes. Thirdly, I will try to point out that a blueprint for equality will inevitably remain just that, a blueprint, a piece of paper, unless it's acted upon. And actions require, well, actors. I think we're particularly well placed here at the ETUI, ETUC, in the next coming days to have a discussion about the role of social actors in general and trade unions actors in particular, but we should acknowledge that change requires a new role for other political actors as well, and for the state. So the building blocks for a more equal society. Well, these days we all accept that inequality is a complex phenomenon with multiple dimensions. We're now all familiar with various studies that analyze and often evidence by reference to increasingly solid data the detrimental effects of inequality in terms of, for instance, economic growth, economic efficiency, crime, life expectancy, mental health, gender-based violence, and so on and so forth, and how they interconnect in particular with wealth inequalities, income inequalities, inequality of opportunity across a range of grounds and personal situations or characteristics, ranging from race to gender to age, but also including increasingly regional and territorial cleavages. These studies have greatly contributed to our understanding of the complexities of the inequality problem. They do, however, engender a risk of fragmentation and of piecemeal approaches to addressing the problem, to finding the answer. Now, something with me. The last edition of our joint ETUC-ETUI publication, Benchmarking Work in Europe, was dedicated to the problem of inequality. Its opening chapter, a guest editorial, was authored by Kate Pickett, who with Frank Wilkinson has co-authored some of the most enlightening publications on the topic of inequality in recent years. She offered to her readership a precious analytical key that can help us, I think, systematize better our understanding of the inequality problem and organize our responses to it in a more structured way. Kate speaks about intersecting inequality and suggests that it may be useful to categorize inequalities as horizontal inequalities and vertical inequalities. You can see this diagram lifted from benchmarking. Horizontal inequalities are inequalities between groups of people with different characteristics, for instance, demographic inequalities, or who live in different places, geographic inequalities. For example, inequalities between men and women, between different ethnic groups, between those with disabilities and those without, between neighborhoods, for example, or between cities and towns, between countries, and region. Vertical inequalities are the inequalities running across societies from the top to the bottom, the inequalities of income and wealth, the disparities in terms of access to power, voice, participation, education, and resources, including health, green spaces, and so on. The scale of these vertical inequalities is a measure, she says, of the social hierarchy, which exacerbates all the other horizontal inequalities. The two inequalities combine, intersect, leaving particular groups in societies worse off, disproportionately worse off than other groups. For example, inequalities between women and men are further widened by vertical inequalities between the rich and powerful at the top and the poor, disempowered at the bottom. In other words, societies with bigger differences between rich and poor are societies in which women are worse off in terms of wealth, but also in terms of power, resources, health, compared to women in more egalitarian societies, and so on. The concept of intersecting and interacting inequalities is especially useful, at least in two ways, besides, of course, the rather obvious point that some groups and individuals can suffer multiple disadvantages and be disproportionately affected by different inequalities. Firstly, it suggests that it's rather illusory to think that one type of inequality is more important than another type. To give an example, what would be the point of resolving the gender pay gap, certainly a big problem, if everyone were on an equally very low pay, or ensuring that people from different regions or communities receive the same access or have the same access to education, but ultimately they remain equally uneducated? Or to give people with different linguistic and racial backgrounds the same income, but without giving them any power, voice, and participation in the running of the societies or the workplaces. Or give women equal opportunities in the labor market, but fail to recognize the effect of lack of power and agency over, for instance, their reproductive rights and roles can have on that. Secondly, it forces us to think seriously about progress made in some areas, but also some of the dimensions that we fail to address as societies and how to go about them. For the past 50 years, at least, at a national and European level, most progress has been achieved in respect of some of the horizontal dimensions of inequality, especially the ones on the left: sex, gender, age, disability, but very little attention has been devoted to the vertical dimensions, especially wealth, income, power, labor and work relations. In many ways, it could even be argued there has been some setbacks and retrenchment, and that arguably goes for some of the horizontal dimensions, including in some European countries that I shall not name out of courtesy. But the idea of intersecting inequalities clearly suggests that one dimension of the problem cannot be solved unless other dimensions are also addressed. There is perhaps no better large-scale empirical example of this than the impact that COVID has had on our societies in general, but on certain groups within our societies in particular. This impact, in all its dimensions, has been painstakingly analyzed by our ETUI colleagues in the last edition of The Bench, of benchmarking. What is clear is that COVID has not been an equal opportunities disease. In terms of growing inequalities, it has disproportionately affected women, those on precarious contracts, the lowest income percentiles, those groups affected by ill health linked to intergenerational inequality and poverty. You will no doubt notice in the coming days that most of our panels seek to explore specific intersections between different dimensions of inequality, tend to establish links, identify problems, suggest solutions. We have panels on gender inequality and unpaid work, constellations of inequality and climate change, technological changes, deteriorating working conditions, psychosocial risks, health inequalities. Other panels focus on shedding a light on new, emerging, and hitherto underexplored dimensions, both vertical and horizontal, or offer a new context for assessing more established grounds and dimensions. There is no attempt in our conference to either exhaust what is perhaps inevitably an ever-growing debate, nor to deprive ourselves from important and alternative methods of inquiry. But it is clear that the building blocks for a more equal society cannot be studied in isolation. They are interlocking blocks and must be approached as such. Thanks. So, principles. Having these building blocks is not, however, a sufficient condition to achieve a more equal society. In order to do so, we need to engage with a deeper type of question pertaining to what kind of equality we want to pursue. Political and regulatory efforts aimed at combating at least some forms of inequality and discrimination are hardly new. The Equal Treatment Directive is nearly as old as me, 5 decades old, and Elaine Vogel-Polsky filled the Defren claim the Brussels Code du Travail even before the adoption of the directive in 76. So why is equality stalling and even retrenching? The work by political philosopher Jerry Cohen can offer us a helpful starting point in terms of possibly understanding what the pinch points are and in terms of possible reform approaches. Cohen suggested that for a more equal society to emerge, 3 sets of actions had to be considered. Firstly, actions aimed at fostering equality of opportunity by removing constraints on opportunity caused by socially constructed obstacles, for instance, prohibited discrimination on certain grounds. And this is something that liberal societies and social democracies have been doing for a good part of the last 50 years, some more, though clearly the process is incomplete. New grounds, new groups need to be identified and protected, and the work should keep apace. Secondly, according to Cohen, by taking actions aimed at correcting for social disadvantage, for instance, Head Start education for children from deprived backgrounds. In this domain, social democracies have a very good track record. But again, there have been setbacks often associated with the marketization of certain essential services, once public services. Thirdly, Cohen says, by taking action aimed at correcting for inborn disadvantage, since native disadvantages are just as unchosen, if not more, as social disadvantages, a process that would include actual and deep redistributive processes being introduced in our societies. This is arguably the area in which not only there has been little or no progress, perhaps with the exception of some anti-discrimination legislation on grounds of disability, but also one where socially constructed notions such as market-mediated meritocracy and desert have prevented a serious debate, let alone progress. But the debate is starting to take off, with important contributions from the likes of Michael Sando and, again, Joe Little. In a similar vein, Sandra Fredman, you will be able to hear from her in one of our plenaries the day after tomorrow, has identified 3 main modalities through which equality legislation can contribute to reducing inequalities. Firstly, there's formal equal treatment, the idea that men and women, for instance, should be treated the same regardless of the sex. However, formal equality, and we're all familiar with this type of legislation, can often lead to counterintuitive results, whereby the same standard, for instance, is applied to groups of people with different characteristics, leading to different results. For instance, just to keep it simple, an identical height requirement for entering the police force can indirectly discriminate against women, especially if set at an unreasonably high level. Now, the concept of indirect discrimination has certainly expanded the reach of equality law, and in effect has underpinned a second, more advanced model of equality of opportunity legislation. So beyond formal equality, equality of opportunity. The crux of this model is to recognize the formal equal treatment against a background of past and structural discrimination can in fact perpetuate disadvantage. But, as noted by Fredman, equality of opportunity is fully compatible with unequal results. Not just because individual talents differ, but because this approach incorporates and emphasizes choice. Once opportunities are made available, each individual can choose her own life course. The model of equal opportunities, does not recognize the far-reaching consequences of social and inborn disadvantage that Cohen refers to. For instance, it does not accept that an equal educational requirement for a job can disproportionately exclude members of a certain community or group. A third model of equality legislation is, or could be, inspired by the idea of the equality of outcomes or equality of results, which is concerned with a substantively fairer distribution of benefits. Affirmative action or preferential treatment of a disadvantaged group, while apparently breaching the formal equality or even equal treatment model, is better and can be better understood as furthering equality of results. Equality of results is also furthered by an acceptance of difference between groups while removing the disadvantages that arise from those differences. Now, in order to remove these disadvantages, societies need to reform, transform a large number of social institutions that contribute to their proliferation. In this sense, equality of results morphs into what Bob Heppel used to define as transformative equality. An example used by Friedman explains the transformative effect of substantial equality. An example used by Friedman to explain the transformative effect of substantial equality is that of working hours. Working hours, she says, have always been patterned on the assumption that childcare takes place outside the labor market. Women who wish to participate in the paid labor market must conform to this paradigm, either by foregoing having children or leaving the children with paid childcarers or family members. Substantive equality aims to change such institutions so that participative parenting is possible for both mothers and fathers in the labor market. In this domain, we see very slow progress, and even some setbacks compared to policies that several European countries had experimented with successfully in the 1960s, for instance, by introducing quotas, subsidies, universal access to basic goods. Again, concepts such as formal equality and market-mediated meritocracy have eroded much of the political base for this type of action. But setbacks are happening also in other domains, from reproductive rights to the effects that the pandemic has had on the female workforce, placing it back in the home, performing and reinforcing its dual role in an increasingly structural way. What is clear, however, is that for real equality to emerge, we need to increasingly focus our attention on more ambitious, redistributive, substantive and transformative models of equality, and regulate our social, economic and political institutions accordingly. We see that both our panels and our plenaries engage with these concepts, with these ideas in a very deep and meaningful way. Oh, too much. The actors. So the actors. Now, striving for equality is not an intellectual exercise. It requires action. And action, I was saying before, requires actors. At the ETUC and ETUI were, of course, particularly well placed to discuss the role of social actors and trade unions in particular. A question that comes up on a fairly regular basis and will come up in one of the plenaries was, what can trade unions do for equality? The Monty Python scene from The Life of Brian comes to mind whenever I hear this question. There is mounting and increasingly robust evidence that trade unions and the labor market, social and industrial relation institutions over which they preside are positively associated with lower levels of inequality. Aside from the increasingly popular charts that you can see in the slide, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with, suggesting a strong correlation between declining union membership, collective bargaining coverage produced by Stan and his colleagues at Union Europa, and rising inequalities in the US, but also in Europe, there has been a sustained production of research ascertaining very clear and strong links between the presence, role, and relative power of trade unions in societies and inequality among wage earners, income inequality, reduced gender and even ethnicity pay gaps or their increase, and even health inequalities. These visibly strong links between trade union presence, strength and effectiveness of collective bargaining processes, and lower levels of inequality should not come as a surprise. As Wilkinson and Piquet point out, unions operate in the labor market, where, I quote, value is created and divided between the various gradations of wage earners. It is there that the inequalities which necessitate redistributions are set up. Labor markets are also the locus where important decisions about power and wealth distribution between capital and labor are ultimately taken. As noted by Anthony Atkinson, it is capital that is relevant when we consider the macroeconomic distribution of income. One of the elements contributing to the reduction of inequality was the rise in the share of wage income to national income. This has now been reversed, he says. It is the share of profits that has risen in recent decades. But unions also operate in the realm of politics, and union decline has, according to Stiglitz, created an imbalance of economic power and a political vacuum. Unions have had a strong influence on many of the post-World War II welfare and labor market reforms and institutions, from health and social security to job security and workplace democracy reforms. But this type of influence has visibly declined in recent decades. Governments and even political parties on the left of the political spectrum have sought to disengage themselves from the influence of unions. We've had some examples just in the last 48 hours. And conversely, decline in trade unionism has been associated even with declining voter turnouts and an impact on democracy across OECD nations. So there is little doubt that trade unions have done and can do a lot to reduce inequalities, but the real question is, what is the state prepared to do in order to make the most of the egalitarian potential and redistributive potential offered by trade union action? In his seminal work, Inequality, What Can Be Done, good title for a conference, Anthony Atkinson stigmatized the role of law in distributing wealth, especially, quotes, with regard to the legislation concerning trade unions. Obviously, a primary responsibility for states all over Europe and for the EU itself will be to take decisive action to remove the legal impediments often generated by hostile anti-union legislation and policies in the first place, to trade union activities, organizing, collective bargaining. But the law ought to be much more ambitious than that. As posited by Keith Ewing, the state should intervene to ensure that the institutional structures are in place to facilitate trade union involvement in the decision-making process, using the law and other forms of state apparatus in a positive sense, rather than merely to remove impediments to trade union organizations. This would require a renewed emphasis to support trade unions and their activities in the workplace and in society, and to promote the full development and utilization, to quote ILO Convention 98, of collective bargaining mechanisms, in particular at sector or cross-industry level. Just as the liberal state has taken it upon itself to promote business activity and economic initiative, an egalitarian state should set for itself the fundamental duty to promote the functioning activities of trade unions in order to ensure, as pointed out by the 1944 ILO Declaration of Philadelphia, a just share of the fruits of progress to all. Just distribution cannot be achieved through the predistributive function of fair and egalitarian reoriented labor market regulation alone. The state has to take it upon itself to redistribute risks, benefit, power, and resources. Historically, this is something that it has performed through systems of progressive taxation of capital, in particular rent, income more broadly, and redistribution through the role of, in particular, welfare states. Tomorrow you will hear from none other than Thomas Piketty on this very topic, which is, of course, the core of his work and has been so for many years. But what I would like to stress here is that this role of the state cannot be relaunched in isolation from a strategy aimed at empowering workers and the trade union movement. Okay, last slide. Oh, thanks. The Institute has a long-standing research interest in the topic of inequality. Our research now suggests that inequalities cause an existential threat to our democracies, the social fabric of our societies, and even to humankind, and this is not emotive language. An angle on which we have worked assiduously is the effect that growing inequalities are having on our societal efforts to tackle climate change. Our assessment differs from that of many other organizations on the topic, whose work essentially suggests that climate change is the priority, and just transitions should simply mitigate the effects, make sure that nobody is left behind. Our approach differs in the sense that we turn the argument on its head. Our impression, our strong impression, corroborated by evidence, mounting evidence, is that in effect, and in fact, unless we tackle inequalities, we will not be able to address climate change effectively. There is a mounting level of evidence, some of it explored by my colleagues Bella and Metap in a chapter of the benchmarking, from which this particular graph has been lifted, whereby it's clear that those who are least responsible for the carbon emissions that generate climate change are those who are disproportionately affected both by climate change itself, but also by the measures, the countermeasures that are currently being envisaged, planned, and implemented in order to reduce our carbon footprints, in order to address the climate change challenge. The lowest percentile across the distribution of income in our societies is the least responsible, and also both the most exposed to the effects of climate change in terms of energy poverty, especially these days, exposure to overheated or cold working environments, and at the same time, the most affected by the various transformative restructuring processes that we will be witnessing in the coming years and decades in order to address climate change. And insecurity, inequality, poverty creates resistance to change. And therefore, it's becoming increasingly clear to us that trade unions must both voice their concerns in terms of participation in these processes, but also strongly ask and put out an agenda for redistribution and reduction of inequalities as a prerequisite for climate change action. Now, it is clear that a lot of these issues that we'll be discussing are not anodyne. They involve deep-seated political choices, and as such, they must be ultimately subject to democratic discussion, democratic debate, and democratic deliberation. Our job here is to clarify what's at stake, to clarify the big questions, to clarify what the trade-offs are, so that this process of democratic debate and democratic deliberation on concrete options can indeed start earnestly. We are looking and we're trying to create a space for this kind of discussion, and our big conference is that space. It's a space populated by unions, by policymakers, internationally acclaimed free thinkers and experts, and by you, by our participants in person and online. We very much hope that you will be able to participate actively throughout all our proceedings, and thank you very much and enjoy the next couple of days. Thank you.